Hey everybody, welcome to the 1947 Rise podcast, a podcast that helps India born, US trained Indians get integrated into the Indian technology ecosystem and inspires them to move back to India to build massive tech companies and or help enable the tech ecosystem. We do this by interviewing India born, US trained Indians who have moved back to India and built massive tech companies themselves and or helped enable the tech ecosystem. I'm excited to have Nitin Sharma on 1947 podcast today. For the last 15 years, Nitin has had the rare fortune of working with world class entrepreneurs in both the US and India. In the US, Nitin worked at NEA, Everfi, and after moving back to India, he joined Lightbox Ventures as a founding principal. After Lightbox Ventures, Nitin founded an early stage fund called First Principles, and currently he's building Antler India as a journal partner and co founder. Nitin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shiva. Great to be here.
Awesome. Let's start by unpacking your background. Let's talk about your journey from growing up in India to moving to the US and then moving back to India.
Sure. So, grew up in a typical middle class Indian household. Dad worked for the government, moved around various cities. Um, Very stereotypical in a way, was very focused on academics. Got a scholarship at the age of 15 to go to Singapore, which is, my only goal growing up was to be an IAS officer. Very sort of, again, like I said, stereotypical. And this offer in Singapore exposed me to a whole new world, and ended up going there for to finish high school. And I'd never assumed I would go to the US for college. Assumed maybe someday I'll go, or perhaps to work later. But as it so happened, I got exposed to the US college system, and I realized it really fit my personality. I was very drawn to a variety of things, and I realized you could try out different disciplines as majors and minors. And anyway, ended up in Los Angeles at USC. Had an amazing time doing three majors and paying for college by working very hard throughout college. Very formative and defining experience for me to actually go through an entire fulfilling college journey, academically, extracurriculars, but also work alongside. So by the time I came out, I think I had something like 2 or 3 years of work experience. It felt like. Started my career in technology and finance at UBS in San Francisco. Went to mergers and acquisitions in tech companies, and this was right around the time Facebook's Web 2.0, as we call it now, was taking off. So there were some very large mergers and IPOs I worked on, but on the other end of the spectrum, there were these very young companies, and that's where I got drawn to. And again, a lot of things in my life, as it is in many people's lives, they happen serendipitously, and you don't plan some things. I had never planned to be in venture, but I assumed venture was a place that people went in after they had made a lot of money, retired, and just wanted to fund other people. That was my image of VC back in 2000s. I got recruited by NEA. Very fortunate to join some amazing legends in the business. That's where I learned the ropes of venture, and that was my first innings. I was based in Washington D.C. Worked on a number of our investments that went public or had good M&A outcomes across clean tech, SaaS, e-commerce, but found a passion for education tech, and really did a lot of work and co-led our first investment in education in a company called Everfi. Then went and worked at that company. Figured it would be interesting to actually learn to build something rather than write memos. So went from this really plush boardroom environment to a garage, literally, and was very interesting to be in an operating role as an early employee, and wear various hats from sales and BD. We bought one of the largest online course in the world at that time. Was a company that I acquired for Everfi, and so that was my journey professionally in the US, and an amazing experience. But I started to think about India for both professional and personal reasons, and this is around 2011, 12. Took some time to go to Wharton. During that time, I started to see that the early stage ecosystem in India was taking off, and I assumed, like many Indians, that I would come back, sometime in my 40s. But that got accelerated by about 10 years, I would say. Um, really saw what was happening, got a chance to spend some time at Inmobi, and saw that the ecosystem was moving from IT services to real global to real global tech products, right? And Inmobi was the first unicorn from India, and the talent that I got to interact with there was world class. So my thesis was India will now become a place where people will build world class product companies for the global market. Inmobi was an outlier in a case, but 3% of the revenue was from India. Almost all of it was global. And this was actually not a very popular time to move back. The economy wasn't doing so well. There was a bit of a lull. There was Flipkart and other companies. The ecosystem was a very, very different ecosystem than what you see today. But I thought that was actually a really interesting time to move back. So I did. Took the plunge. Like you mentioned, my journey in India began as part of the founding team of Lightbox. I started working with Sandeep Modi, and he had earlier managed Kleiner Perkins and Sherpalo in India. So there was a portfolio that we acquired. In parallel, a new fund was raised, 100 million, which was the largest new fund in that year in India. And 3.5 years, founders, first two founders have a really amazing experience to come back and start working with founders in India. A very different experience, which we will unwrap a little bit. And yeah, and then we can continue the rest of the journey in India in your next few questions.
Yeah, no, it looks seems like you are pretty clear about your thought process. You knew you were you wanted to come back and work at great places like InMobi, and then of course Lightbox, and then you later on you went on and you founded First Principles, and now you're building Antler. So let's start by talking about First Principles, and then we'll
Yeah.
dive into Antler.
So funnily, you mentioned a clear thought process, and I don't know if I had. So I think there are some interesting things I sometimes reflect on. None of the transitions I made were planned. Almost none. There was no game plan, or frankly, sometimes not even a super clear thought process. But you're right in the sense that I think what I followed in every career transition is like going back to some core values and asking myself what I really value. For me, it's been impact and growth. I think that those two reasons were philosophically why it made sense to move back to India, for example. Even though certainly I was very, very fortunate to have a very interesting trajectory in the US, and it was the same reason that I have always tried to take a risk in each transition and move earlier and earlier in stage. If you think about it, right, I call my US journey was a lot about the 10 to 100 phase, investing wise at least. Then going to work at a startup was 0 to 1. Lightbox was certainly 0 to 1. Sorry, 1 to 10. And yes, as you mentioned, after spending time in Bombay and Bangalore remotely, well, I used to travel a lot to Bangalore. Certainly felt that I wanted to go towards the early stage side of things. Bangalore was where all the action was. And I wanted to work on a variety of new themes and spaces, including blockchain, crypto. And so 2017, I started my journey in Bangalore actually. Again, had no clear plan as such, organically started to angel invest and work directly with founders. Right? So after the first few investing journeys, I had always been part of a larger team or an established fund, but it was a really interesting challenge to start working directly with founders. And a founder will have you on their cap table only if they see some value in you as a person, as an individual, in that context, right? Because you're not coming with deep pockets or a 30-year-old brand name or something. So that was an interesting challenge, which I enjoyed. One thing led to another over the last 3 4 years. That became First Principles as a portfolio. About half of it was blockchain and crypto, and as I think some of the listeners might, I was a very early mover in that space in the Indian context, the first VC in India to go all in for about a year and a half full time on seeding blockchain ventures from India. Wanted to create a studio from India to build for the world, and regulations made that extremely challenging. So I kept investing instead in projects in India and abroad. We had a community called Encrypt. Blockchain regulation is all the talk right now. We had actually done the first big effort in that direction by engaging a lot with policy members, doing a massive effort around developers and what they need from policy. So this was basically the journey of First Principles was very organic and became this portfolio of about 40. And I certainly realized that the next step was to, while the game of syndicates and solo capitalists is a really interesting one, and I enjoyed that. I felt that I wanted to institutionalize it, put more capital to work, and also a broader effort with the team, and bring more to the founders. Wanted to work with someone as a co-founder as well. I realized I was becoming the bottleneck. So for all these reasons, I you know was in that mind space and started to interact with Antler. Antler had done an amazing job building out the fastest growing early stage VC platform in the last 3 or 4 years. Now we are in 17 locations globally. And also in that process, Rajiv and I got to know each other, and he comes from a founder operator background, having started Urban Ladder. So that's what was the genesis. The going into Antler, the goal for us is we are bringing together my investing experience, Rajiv's operating experience, and Antler's backbone or global network to the benefit of founders in India who are just starting out. So first 6 months of their journey, let's say, both at First Principles and even obviously at Antler, like more than two-thirds of the things I have done investment wise are cases when it's just a founder and a concept. Sometimes just the beginnings of the product, but mostly not that even. So that's what we are trying to do. We are focused on pre-seed, true pre-seed. Like I said, the earlier the better. We are trying to be the institution that can support founders. While there are some amazing platforms like AngelList, there are great angels, and I think that is all wonderful. But one thing that founders can also benefit from is an institution that is geared up to play in multiple stages, starting from the very, very first day of the company. So that's what we are trying to. That gap is something we feel exists in India as a global institution, right? Not just a homegrown institution, but a group that can connect a founder with a very vast global network, and that fits very well with the idea of building in India for the world. So that's the second pillar for us, right? So first is pre-seed institutional. The second is building in India for the world. That's what we have seen in a majority of the founders we have funded so far. It's been a 10-month journey since I joined. We announced the India expansion last year. We were working behind the scenes on creating the program. This year, we launched in a full-fledged way. We've had about 9,000 founders who have applied, reached out. We've run two cohorts. We have made our first crypto investment now. We have done a total of 14 investments. Some are announced yet, some are not. And most importantly, we've built a fantastic team where everyone is a founder, has been a founder before, which we thought was quite important. So, building in India for the world, connecting a founder to this vast network. So that's what the Antler journey is about.
Yeah, Nathan, seems like Antler is a great fit to your worldview and to your thought process, right? Like you've been thinking about Indian companies will build products in India for the world, and then you realize that you enjoy at very early stages. Hence, you started First Principles. So it's a combination of both, and then that's what Antler is. What's the vision that you and Rajiv have for Antler India in the, let's say, next few years?
So I think we are. This is also evolving, of course, and we are ourselves a startup. We are a fund, but we think of ourselves as a startup as well. I think we are trying to build roughly two engines. One we call pre-seed, and one we call pre-founder. So pre-seed, as we just talked about, I think most of your audience would be aware. And of course, people use these labels very broadly today, right? So, what is a seed? What is a pre-seed? It's really hard to tell. But in our mind, it's simply the first 6 months of the founder's journey before they have a true MVP or product, the first institutional check that comes in, and sometimes the very first check itself, not just institutional. Pre-founder is something which Antler is very close to sort of the Antler DNA. The way Antler started in many other countries uh, was through the idea of a co-founder matching program. And that's a very interesting gap that still exists. And I think that even though the ecosystem has expanded a lot and founders have matured, and there are many more second-time founders, as I just mentioned, I faced this issue myself in my journey, right? When I was in the sense of creating an investing startup, I was looking for a co-founder, and I think that it's such a big decision. It's as big a decision as marriage, right? So this gap still exists, and that's what Antler has started with in other countries. We did not start with that in India, uh, partly because of COVID, and we want to create a setting where founders can perhaps get to know each other. But this is something which will probably be an area we will consider in the future. But the pre-founder aspect of Antler really is, we are asking ourselves, what are the gaps? So it could be co-founder matching, but one other one which we have started with in India, right, is the college founder. It's uh, it's it's easy to say we want to fund college founders. It's really hard to create a platform, a structure, a support network that can actually help a founder who is, an outlier founder who is in that phase of life, right? By definition, has not worked, has not built something, is just this young gun with a lot of passion, right? And we want to, this is hard, this is really hard work, and we are putting in the resources to make this happen. So we launched the Antler India Fellowship a couple of weeks back. Tremendous response so far. And what we want to do is really, for example, in that sense, go out to not just the tier one colleges, but elsewhere, and unearth the, call it, up to 10, and we'll do it a few times a year, I think, up to 10 in a batch, truly amazing people who are thinking about jumping into entrepreneurship. And we want to give them a grant which has no strings attached. And that's it. And we just want to see what happens. It's an experiment. We don't want to put lots of expectations on them, right? So this is an example, and I think there'll be others which we might do specific thematic cohorts. We don't know. We are trying to figure out. We're trying to find that product market fit and where the need is the highest. But generally, all of this I call the pre-founder, right? So we want to go very early in the journey, and um, just try to fill whatever gaps exist still for people who are in that process of getting started.
Gotcha. No, you're looking to stay pre-seed, pre-founder, and then of course along the way, you'll figure it out, and a lot of the things will come organically. Nathan, you moved back in 2013, and fast forward to today, and what we've seen this year is just unreal, unprecedented. I think we had what 30 unicorns until 2020, and in 2021 we've had 40. The ecosystem is just compounding at an insane pace. Can you maybe like talk about the evolution of the Indian startup ecosystem from 2013 to today?
Yeah, absolutely. And credit to the folks who were building it even before that, right? Because those and people who came back and people who were founders at the time when it wasn't so fashionable. So I think we should always remember those are the people who sort of sowed the seeds. When I moved back, of course, there was already a critical mass. E-commerce had started taking off, but yes, looking back, it feels like decades ago. Honestly, it's not even been one whole decade in the true sense. But I would say, what are the big differences I see? I think number one, um, the persona of the founder. I think today that founder is far more ambitious, um, typically a bit younger, um, moving have with ambition. Obviously trying to move at a very different speed. And I'm not just saying capital wise, but just in general, their aspirations around product growth, user growth, etc. Many more who are very global in their mindset, which is where I think I mentioned building in India for the world is an important theme for us. And that definition is also expanded because it's no longer about only SaaS or SMB, dev tools, etc. Right? So we think of version one of India tech was IT services, and maybe version two was companies that got started with SaaS, SMB focused SaaS. Sometimes starting with a cost proposition rather than innovation as a proposition, and then maybe version three was dev tools, right, where you had to sell to a developer instead of a typical business buyer. But I call it version 4.0 now of going global from India, which is really around more and more of vertical SaaS and more dev tools, but also consumer companies. So we're really seeing interesting examples in fintech, crypto, health tech, ed tech, right, where founders are taking that global view. My one of my favorite examples is one of my earlier investments on Juno, which launched a regulated neobank in the US for US customers while building in India, and is now doing a really interesting bridge between crypto and banking, and being able to build a lot of this from India. Other differences, I think founders are also. I used to see a lot of sort of X for India, right? Uber for India, Stripe for India, etc. types of things, and while that's still part of the mix, I mean, today you have a very different mindset, not so much copy paste, but more homegrown, and taking the best of parts of some of these models abroad, but really localizing it for India. And yeah, so I think those would be, and finally, I would say you're also seeing the emergence of the Gen Z entrepreneur, who is, in some sense, some of these folks have spent all their life, in a digital sense, and they may be in Bangalore, they might be closer in terms of their aesthetic to someone in New York versus Bhopal, right? And and so that's an interesting opportunity. And I think finally, at the same time, let's not forget, on the other end of the spectrum, people who are really trying to go deeper in the as we call Bharat market, right? Which was not fashionable back then, because I think a lot of founders used to think they start with what gets funded, and because there were all these assumptions around monetization and LTV of a typical Indian user, mass Indian user, and of course you didn't even have things like geo, so penetration, connectivity, all of these were big issues. And so a lot of founders used to start with what will get funded and answer the wrong questions. Today, I think many more founders are starting from what are the problems I have seen in my own life? What is this user who is now at least connected, right? Maybe their incomes are not growing, but at least they're connected and they're used to digital experiences and digital products. Like, what can we build for them, right? So you see things like Kutum and Share Chat, etc., but also more interesting things in agri-tech and fintech that are serving this customer. So, I think these are the 4 or 5 ways in which I think the ecosystem's really evolved. The capital flows are, you know, they've ebbed and flowed over time. Like there was a big boom time in 2014, 15. A little bit after the election happened, a lot of money started coming in. Flipkart valuations jumped, and then after 2016, when Flipkart acquisition happened, there was also a lull, right? If you might remember, 15, 16, there was a bit of a winter, and then 2000, 18 onwards, I think it's just been going up and up and up, right? But that is also just in conjunction with the global plays. So I don't think that I read so much into it. Frankly, I'm not sure why. I think people are actually overestimating the opportunities in India in some cases still, to be very frank, because we still have to be mindful of the fact that income growth is not as it's just not happening as fast as we would like. And let's not forget, let's not look at capital flows as a sign of validation, right? Because that is more a function of global liquidity, what's happening in China, a lot of money flowing to India, a lot of money generally flowing to early stage tech. So, I agree with your statement that 50 unicorn number this year, let's say 50 new ones created this year, right? That's amazing. That's truly amazing for people like us. But I don't want to read so much more into it. It's not possible that suddenly in 1 year the entrepreneur quality has gone up, doubled or tripled, right? That's not possible. So I actually wish people were a little more disciplined about the number of bets they make or the speed at which they move. But I think that's, it's just how the markets evolve at the early stage.
No, that's a great overview of the ecosystem, Nitin. Thanks for sharing. And I totally agree with you. Like nowadays, we do see at YC Demo Day, we're building Udan for Pakistan. We're building Khata Book for Indonesia, or
Yeah.
for that matter, Southeast Asia. And and I think we've seen this cycle earlier. And what I mean by that, of course, US pioneered it. China was, copycatting from US, and then India was doing the same thing. And as you discussed, you said that founders are doing that because it's more fundable. And then once China had those, companies like Tencent or Alibaba or a bunch others, and then they were like, okay, what's next? Now they started building products for or they started solving their own problems, and that's what's happening in India as well. And Nitin, you've spent a good amount of time in US. You worked at great companies, and in hindsight, what were some of the experiences or skills that you picked up in the US, which ended up becoming valuable in India?
Oh, it's a good question, because frankly, there is that, but there's also unlearning, right? And I think many of your guests earlier probably had spoken about that, I'm sure. But I'll start with the biggest lessons, or how your mindset that you develop outside in the US, for example, or specifically in Silicon Valley, kind of helps you. So I think that it certainly makes you think big. That's and I still think that a lot of founders that I come across are not thinking big enough. And that's by osmosis in the valley. You pick up that, right? Everyone is thinking of not just starting something, but imagining what it would take to make something big, right? The capital BIG, right? And so whether that's thinking about just the vision, ambition, how to scale, how to solve problems with product, etc., I think that becomes part of your mindset, right? I think in some sense, there is certainly a sense of professionalism, of efficiency, of speed that becomes very natural when you're working in that environment. And it's not always the case when you come back and you have to find your tribe. You have to find your tribe. You have to find the people that align with those values, and then you can put those to good use. And if you don't find that tribe, you can get frustrated also. So yeah, I would say, generally, I mean, there are many things, but typically, and I'm not trying to generalize too much, but typically, if you've spent enough time there, you get really bought into the idea of thinking big, of focusing on product, on focusing on technology as the multiplier rather than throwing money or people at the problem. And certainly in your way of working, you get you definitely become someone who pays a lot more attention to doing things the right way, doing things efficiently. Communication, I think, is the other piece, right? Just the communication skills that you develop, written, oral, that definitely, I think, can go a long way in terms of being a better leader also. Now, all that being said, I think you have to unlearn a lot when you come back to India, right? And it's an interesting experience for those of us who grew up here, especially in middle class India. And so some of how to work in India, but if you've been abroad for some time, you've sort of lost those muscles. You have to come back and develop those muscles again. So yeah, I think for the first few years it was as much learning as unlearning for me. And of course, there the I think a lot of people must have talked about it in your previous shows, right? Coming back, I think the first thing that one needs to adapt to is patience. Even though today things are actually, frankly, quite good. I mean, you come back, you can live in cities like Bangalore or South Bombay or South Delhi. You can pretty much have some semblance of what your life was outside India in terms of what you took for granted, efficiency, productivity wise. So you can create your bubble, right? So you find your tribe, you create your bubble, but it still will irk you every day in some form, right? So patience is needed to navigate both your personal life and your professional life. And similarly, right, people, I mean, it's very natural to start applying that lens to startups in India, right? Oh, why don't we have this kind of user growth? Why don't we hire this kind of a person? Why don't we do this or that? And you realize that when reality hits you, like the founder, for example, I'm talking specifically as an investor or someone who's helping a founder, right? You realize that the reality on the ground is very, very different. There is more friction in the environment. The founder in India versus the founder in the US. Founder in India has a, earning a rupee is much harder than earning a dollar in the absolute sense, right? Um, so I think the job is 100 times harder. Uh, Finding the right people, finding people who you can trust, finding people who will actually, own the problem. Because I think that's a big difference. I also forgot to mention. I think there's a stronger sense of owning problems in the US tech culture. I think certainly India is getting there. But finding these kinds of people and creating a team and culture, it takes time. And similarly, acquiring a user, changing user behavior, dealing with other stakeholders, suppliers. I mean, every step of the way there is a little bit more friction in India, right? So you have to be patient, basically. So you have to let go of that ambition, speed, and realize that it will still you just need, it's a different curve. You'll still get to the same point, but it will be a different curve, right? Maybe for a while you have to give it time. Um, and then I would say the last thing, unlearning is really about coming back to realizing that relationships matter a lot more, right? It's not um, here that personal chemistry is what's going to make things happen, right? Not some top down process. So you start to focus a lot more on that, right? The relationship that you have with your team, with your founder, with your co-founder, etc. So I mean, I know I could go on and on about other learnings and unlearnings, but I think that would be my summary.
No, Nitin, you were spot on. And so one thing is pretty evident. India has become an opportunity hub, especially if you're working in tech. Earlier Indians living abroad would move back to India, maybe because of the family, or a foreign land is not for everybody. Some people just feel lonely. But one thing that has changed, in the last 2, 3 years at least, that you can come back to India and, as you said, like thinking massive, right? Think big. You can really build or leave a legacy. In fact, you can just come back and build a, whatever, like whatever valuation, you can become a billionaire. I truly believe in that. And and because of that, a lot of people have started thinking about moving back to India. And what advice would you give? How should they plan their move back to India, or maybe the framework they can have in mind?
So, you know, it's a really good question. If you take a little bit of a longer term view and not just the bubble right now, and I think first of all, there is no way to compare. They're not the same experiences. They're fundamentally different experiences. So I think one of the other things I would like to add to the last answer is when you move back, you need to stop comparing, because you cannot compare those two things, as and if you keep comparing your incomes, your X or Y or etc., you can get irrationally exuberant or depressed, right? So first thing is, like, they are not actual comparisons. I think advice. So I still think that for the large part, moving back to India for a lot of people will still feel like a little bit of an irrational bet. And I don't mean crazy or anything. I think, of course, today we know that you can come back and create real value for yourself. So that can be rational. But what I mean is, I think for most people who have spent, let's say, at least 5 to 7 years abroad, in the US specifically, let's say, I think what I've seen is most people are happier when they come back because of some clarity about why they're doing it. And it could be, it's a very personal decision. There's no right answer. But it usually falls in one of these buckets, right? Family. And if that's the case, then that obviously is the most important thing in life. Some people, I think, really would benefit from the clarity of thought around, like, look, I want to do something meaningful in India, right? Could be just an emotional thing about creating impact in India. And I meet a lot of folks, and I myself feel like to some extent that was part of my decision as well. Or it could be about being a founder in India, right? Which again is not necessarily a rational decision, right? And that's actually more fun, right? I think, if you come back for these reasons, you will probably have, even if you have challenges, you will see the meaning in it, right? Uh, but I don't particularly believe that people would be necessarily happy with thinking about it rationally and saying, "Oh, let me go back and then now there are so many economic opportunities. Can I make the same money?" Because I think that, a in a longer term sense, you will still make more money. I think in the US or somewhere, frankly, unless you're an entrepreneur and create wealth. And also I think that sometimes even if you are earning decently in India, you will find other parts of your life to be suboptimal, perhaps. So I think that, long story short, I found that in my experience, at least, people who came back with one of those more irrational reasons were actually happier, adapted better, and were able to surmount the challenges that came along the way. And anyone who moved simply thinking of, like, oh, there is a near term bubble, there's an opportunity, let me go back, let me see if I can land in a nice cushy job. Sometimes that doesn't work out well because you're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, no, totally agree with you, Nitin. And you've had a fantastic career so far. And but the reality is, of course, most of the time we are just figuring it out. And when things are not working out or going, according to the way that you want them to go, what frameworks do you use, or the questions you ask yourself, to get yourself back on track?
Oh, well, I mean, I thanks for saying that it's been a successful, phenomenal career. I actually really don't see it that way. I think it's a work in progress, and especially in what we do, or what I do, for example, your success is the success of your founders, and so all you can celebrate is process for a while. The actual outcomes may or may not happen, may take 10 years, and it even if it turns out well, it'll be largely luck. So, I just have a very philosophical view about these things, that you have to keep coming back to the process, the inputs, not outputs, and the why of why you're doing it. Because if you if you lose that, then it certainly, there can be periods of a slump or issues in your personal life, etc., which can make, it might seem fine to the outside world, but it could actually be a very challenging period for you. And what kind of brings you back to a place of productive work and peace is really going back to why you're doing it. And typically, the hardest thing is that there is so much noise in our environment, so much noise, unbelievable, right? Social media, funding is happening, unicorns, people making money, um, and I think that it can really make you forget the why of why you're doing something. And so you've got to find your own zone. Like I said, you've got to find your tribe in terms of the people you're with, to find your own bubble in terms of the environment that you're in, and you've got to find your own personal zone, whether that's meditation or something else, right? And keep reminding yourself um, why you're doing this, and believe in that, and know that it's very common for great careers to have slumps and long periods when nothing happens, and just like a startup or just like a new technology, slowly then suddenly, right? So overnight success is really not overnight. Sometimes takes decades in the making. So I try to remind myself of that and maintain humility. And I think once you go through enough things in life, you realize that it's all the stories we tell ourselves, right? So, and a lot of it is just luck. So I think just coming back to who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, what you value. But it needs constant reinforcement. I mean, it's like I said, it's a very, very noisy environment that we work in.
Nathan, if money and attention are not needed anymore, what would you work on?
Oh, wow. I would like to eventually Okay, well, let me put it this way, right? I I would still like to do what I'm generally working on in this phase of my life. It's things like, the future of Web 3 and what it could mean to India. How can we have more things built out of India for a global market? Areas like mental wellness, climate change, like those are fairly meaningful. And in a sense, being a VC is a very fortunate. It's a very lucky place to be. It's not all glamorous. It's exactly the opposite of what people think it is. But it's still a very lucky place to be because you, by definition, are working with smart, ambitious people. I mean, there's no other job in the world where you wake up and, by definition, you're only working with smart, ambitious people who want to change the world, right? And your job is to help them, enable them, debottleneck them in whatever way you can. So I still think I would be doing some version of what I'm doing. Perhaps I would be maybe closer to certain things where the impact part is stronger. But if you ask me a different question, in a different phase of life, what I would like to do, I'd like to do something around, education policy in India, or the way our education system works. Because, every time I think about it, if we could change, like that's where the minds are trained, right? If we could change a few things there, hundreds of millions of people will have a different way of thinking, a different way of acting, and that could create like massive systemic change over time, right? So I don't know. I have no specific thoughts. I also care a lot about some other areas like philanthropy and animal rights, etc. I have a lot of interest in those areas, but I don't know if it's money, man. I don't know if it's money that's keeping me away from. I think it's I've just assumed it's a different phase of life when I will explore those things in more detail.
Love it, Nitin. This was amazing. Thanks a lot for making the time, coming on the podcast, sharing your experiences, and talking about the evolution of the Indian technology ecosystem, and bringing Antler to India. And ever since you've moved back to India, you've been enabling the ecosystem, whether through Lightbox, through First Principle, or through working with the policymakers. I think that's a very important role there. And uh, and yeah, we are looking forward to what you have in store for yourself and Antler in India.
Thanks, Shiva. This was fun. Always good to take a step back and reflect on this kind of a journey, and hope some of this is helpful to our listeners. And good luck to everyone who's making these transitions.